Welcome all attendees. This is the second WISER and FCFA joint webinar on the co-production of weather and climate services. The title of today's webinar is 10 Principles for Good Co-Production of African Climate Services. My name is Suzanne Carter and I will be your host for the webinar today. I head up the Climate Services Practice Area at South South North, and I'm involved in both the Weather and Climate Information Services for Africa, or WISER, and the Future Climate for Africa, or FCFA programs. That will both be featured in today's webinar. Our presenters will be sharing 10 principles for good co-production, outlining these and sharing tips and case studies of successful integration of these principles. We will only be addressing questions after the presentations have been made. Attendees are just questions via the Q&A button, which should bottom your Zoom webinar, and then I will direct that question to the Q&A. We'll also run a short poll at the end of the webinar to get your feedback. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the WISER YouTube channel, so please consider sharing it with anyone you know who may have wanted to join today but couldn't. Today's presenters are Catherine Vincent from Kalima Integrated Development Solutions, Anna Steynor from the Climate System Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town, Emma Visman from King's College and VNG Consulting, and myself. As mentioned in our last webinar, the content we are presenting is drawn from a soon-to-be-launched manual on co-production, which shares practical guidance. The manual is drawing on learning from 18 case studies across Africa, many of which were funded by the UK Department for International Development projects, such as WISER, FCFA, the Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia, and the Building Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Extremes and Disasters. We will be able to share a copy of the manual this month, and there will also be a formal launch of a web version of the manual, which will coincide with the session we are hosting at the African Climate Risk Conference on the 8th of October in Addis Ababa. This slide shows the 10 principles that we will be covering today. While you have a chance to look at those and get a sense of what we'll be covering, I will hand over to the next presenter, which is Catherine Vincent. Thank you, Catherine.
Hello, everyone. So co-producing climate services is about customizing information to meet demands. And doing that requires that we have an understanding of the context and the decision that the information is intended to address. Oh, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So if we look at understanding the context, co-production involves a diagnostic process where users and producers come together for a dialogue with the aim of determining how to develop weather and climate information that will be useful for a decision maker working in that particular context. From my own experience in the Mfula project, I can say that we've learned a lot through trial and improvement about how to approach this process of understanding the context and the decision. Initially, we assumed that users would be able to simply tell us what climate information they required. But in fact, we needed to undertake a number of co-exploratory processes that involved surveys, interviews, and workshopping in order to unpack the context and the decision points. We can think of this as a doctor and a patient. So if someone is feeling unwell, they don't go to the doctor and tell them what medicine they need. Instead, they go and they explain their symptoms, and then the doctor uses their expertise to prescribe the treatment. And if it doesn't work, the patient comes back and the doctor will try another option. And I think this is quite a nice analogy for the role of producers and users in co-producing weather and climate information, through working together to understand the context and the decision in order to be able to provide new, useful and usable information. Next slide, please. So in Malawi, for example, we use in the Mvula project exploratory surveys and interviews with tea farmers to understand the nature of the crop growth cycle for tea and the physiological limits of the tea crop to certain characteristics such as high temperatures. And when we understood those particular decisions, then it's possible to generate climate information that's appropriate for that particular decision and that particular context. Slide, please. And then to give another example, in Lake Victoria in Kenya, the Wiser Western project looked at the user decision context, and that led to the production of daily weather forecasts for fishermen to inform decisions about when it would be safe to fish. Because until that point, fishing-specific forecasts had not been available, and many fishermen would take to the lake in dangerous conditions. So tailoring to the decision and the context is key, and a key principle. Next slide, please. So related to this, we can come to our second principle, which is flexibility. Flexibility is important in co-production processes because they're often innovative, bringing together people who perhaps don't usually work together, have different styles of working, different incentives for working. And so as a result of that, the process tends to be quite iterative and therefore not fully predictable. It's rarely possible to stick rigidly to a process that's mapped out at the start. Instead, co-production requires the participants in the process to be flexible in what they're doing and how they're doing it in order to achieve the common desired goal. And continuously reflecting on that unfolding process and monitoring and learning from that can be used to refine products and processes, extend activities, and even bring on board people and areas of expertise that perhaps hadn't been identified at the outset of the project. And so allowing extra time for these processes is a key component of flexibility. Next slide, please. So I can return to the example of the Mvula project as one where we needed to be flexible. Working with users beyond the tea farmers, our initial co-exploration process identified interest in the increased occurrence of extreme events such as droughts or floods, but it didn't define the critical threshold for such events, at the point at which it would become a particular problem that people wanted to have forewarning about. So we used that as a starting point for a follow-on process that was required to facilitate the identification of the metrics themselves, which were required to co-produce the actual information. So as a result of that, we used different methods than we'd originally planned, and it took us longer than we initially expected to identify the climate information that was necessary for the context. And we had to be quite flexible in our management of the process to reflect that. So having introduced two of our principles, tailor to context and decision and keep flexible, I'll now hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Catherine. Next slide, thank you. So one of the cornerstones to co-production, so this, I think this is one of the most important principles, is to build trust amongst the partners. So if you think about any relationship, building trust is essential for sharing information in a manner that no one's guarded and is a very honest information sharing amongst different partners from different places. So building trust is essential for sharing an understanding of how the co-production process is going to happen. So deciding that together in a trust-based relationship. And it's essential for creating a sustained collaboration. So a collaboration that goes beyond just a project cycle and one that is something that can be sustained into future collaborations and future ongoing measures past just one project. And it also helps to agree the most effective interaction styles. So if you're bringing together people from lots of different sectors and lots of different places and lots of different countries, there can be very different ways of interacting. So what is the best way of interacting that everybody can get on board with and everybody can agree to? So building this trust takes a long time, and it shouldn't be underestimated how long it takes, but it's an essential principle behind co-production, that those trust relationships are built. So a tip to building trust could be a combination of informal and formal engagements. quite often the lunches or the teas or the dinners or the drinks after the sessions actually help form those relationships more than the actual sessions do. So, for instance, having outings or field trips can really help to create a bond between the group and build that trust relationship. Next slide, please. So as an example, I'm taking the FCFA Fractal project, which was a 4-year project that was aimed at unpacking some of the burning issues within cities in Southern Africa to understand what the climate change risks were within those cities. And Fractal took a very emergent and flexible approach to understanding these burning issues. So during the first learning, we had workshops called learning labs, which weren't exactly the same as workshops, but I'll explain them a bit later. But these learning labs were very much about going into a room and having a discussion together. And not going in with an agenda of what we wanted to get out of the process, but it was more about collaboratively deciding what everybody wanted to get out of the process and what would make most sense to everybody, gaining something at the end of the process that we could take away as a kind of tangible learning or tangible output. So one of the mechanisms used in the Fractal project was embedded researchers. So in each of the cities, we placed an embedded researcher for a period of 3 years into the city, and that researcher became part of the city functioning. So they really gained an understanding of how the city functions and were able to act as a conduit between the city and the researcher team, so that we could bring people together and build that trust relationship across the researchers and the cities. And again, we worked across disciplines to foster the trust and collaboration. So there were multiple people involved in the project, but there were researchers, there were city government officials, there were private sector individuals, there were parastatals, and everybody worked across these disciplinary lines to foster a strong collaboration. So one of the quotes that I pulled from the Fractal project reporting was one of the participants said, the longer we work together, the more familiar we get with each other, the closer we get, and the better we work together. And I think that kind of encapsulates this idea of a trust relationship in projects. Okay, next slide, please. So another principle is to enhance inclusivity. So this is really about enhancing inclusivity across marginalized groups. So for instance, taking into account gender, disability, social equity, and recognizing that everybody has something to offer, and there are different knowledges, including non-scientific knowledge, that can be offered in creating a co-production process that is really inclusive. So we need to provide that safe space for the open dialogue, using less scientific jargon, so not excluding people by using language that is opaque and doesn't include everybody. And really trying to create that space where everybody's knowledge, no matter where they come from or their gender or their disability or any background they have, has a valid way of engaging in the process, because everybody's knowledge is really important. So a tip for doing this is potentially to actually nominate an inclusion champion at the beginning of the process to raise awareness, and even run training if needed, to make sure that the process is as inclusive as possible. Next slide, please. So one example of a process that was very inclusive was the Braced Gender Rights Shop. So the Braced program had a number of projects under it, and those projects were invited to come together and write pieces on how NGOs have used gender approaches in the design and implementation of their projects. So to do this, they were invited to write a draft before the workshop, and then they came together in a workshop and in a facilitated space were able to share those drafts, gain feedback on them, and work in a very constructive and equitable environment to revise the drafts, to share ideas, and to consciously create a process that was constructive and equitable and included everybody, no matter what gender or culture or race. So this was a very consciously framed process to enable people to interact in this honest and respectful way. Another example of an inclusive process was the AMA project, developed a concept called Theatre Forum, and it was run by the Senegalese Theatre Forum group, and they essentially created plays or role playing where people were able to engage in a way that they felt comfortable. So it really included people from all different aspects of the project and different cultures and sectors. Next slide, please. Another principle of co-production is to support conscious facilitation. So having a conscious facilitation of the process is incredibly important. You need to really think through the co-production process before going into it, because doing this process is kind of ad hoc, really it doesn't generate the kind of will that is needed through co-production. So importantly, it's very important to create a safe space where people feel that they are able to share and able to contribute without any barriers. Particularly diffusing power dynamics and hierarchies. This can become a particular problem in Africa, and also in researchers coming from their ivory towers and feeling like they know they have the superior knowledge. And this is really not the case, and we need to break down those barriers and recognize that everybody brings really important knowledge to the processes. So it's not about this hierarchical relationship between researchers and practitioners. And then recognizing multiple worldviews. So particularly in the current context, there's often northern-driven research projects, and we need to recognize that the northern views are very different from African worldviews, and we need to be able to accommodate everybody in the process. So this facilitation is incredibly important in facilitating a process that is amicable and doesn't make people alienated towards the process. So as a tip for that, facilitation is actually a skill in itself, and not everybody will feel comfortable in the role, and not everybody should be doing the role. So it may actually be prudent to bring in somebody with facilitation expertise who's able to facilitate the process in a way that means that you have a maximum utility of the process and get maximum output. Next slide, please. So again, I'm bringing in an example from the Fractal project, but the Fractal project used experienced facilitators who were actually part of the project team and were there for the whole project process. And so these facilitators have a bit of a background in the topics that we were talking about, and climate science and development. But they were experienced facilitators who were able to run a process that was very different from the average workshop. So for instance, there were innovative techniques used such as games, role play, energizers, and this really got people engaged in the project in a way that a sit-down workshop or a set of PowerPoint slides just really wouldn't have done. So I've pulled a couple of quotes again from the reporting, which really show how useful this conscious facilitation was for the process. So one person said, these ones, being workshops, were very different. They were very involving. You would act things out. You could do posters creating your future of your city. Somehow you're part of the process and what's going on. You're not sitting passively. And then somebody else said, I like the format of engagement. The manner and diversity of presentations, the ideas, topics, and activities were so inspiring. I learned more than I would in school. Fractal is, for me, transformative. And I think that's what you want to leave your project with, is that idea of it's actually been transformative. And I can say with certainty that in the Fractal project, those relationships are ongoing. Even though the Fractal funding is winding up, the relationships that have been built in Fractal are so strong that those relationships are still ongoing. Next slide, please. So another principle is embracing diversity and respecting differences. So this is different from including minority groups, but more around respecting that every sector, discipline, decision-making type has their own knowledge. including non-scientific knowledge, and these are all incredibly important to the process. So we need to be including different people and including all those knowledge types and listening to everybody. So it means respecting different values, respecting different cultures, and respecting different knowledge systems. So a tip potentially for doing this is to create spaces from the outset of the project that recognize these different value types and the knowledge that each individual brings to the process. So validating everybody in the process. It's not okay for some people to feel like their knowledge is not as good as somebody else's knowledge. Next slide, please. So an example of when this was done was through the FCFA Climate Risk Narratives project. So the climate risk narratives are a communication tool, but also a discussion starter for how climate change may affect a particular region. So we use this within cities in the FCFA project to outline a set of future narratives. So it's usually 3 or 4 future narratives of what the city might look like in the future under different climate change scenarios. And it was written from the view of you already in the future and what will your city look like. So in this project, each of those risk narratives was written by in-country researchers in collaboration with city officials from the city. So it was very much written by in-country knowledge and taking into account the language that they wanted to use, the values and cultures that they experience. And it wasn't written by external researchers who don't know about the in-country knowledge and values. So this was an incredibly important process for bringing these climate risk narratives home to a reality for the in-country decision makers, and it being something that is owned by them and not owned by external researchers. So I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over now to Suzanne for the next principles.
Thanks, Anna. So the first one I'm going to tell you about is deliver timely and sustainable service. And I think this one is also one of the really important ones, because if you don't get the timing right and you can't offer something that's going to continue into the future, then you're probably not doing the right thing. So one of the things that we thought is really important is when you are developing your co-production process, is to make sure that everybody in the room, the producers and the users, can determine what timeframes are actually important to them. And you might find that academics or scientists have different priorities to the user. And how do you navigate that and manage the expectations between them to make sure that everyone is getting what they need from the process and that they are able to make sure that the climate service is actually delivering something useful to the end user, but that isn't so unrealistic in terms of what's possible with the science that it's set up for failure. So it sort of builds on some of the other ones we've already been talking about. So you have to have that trust between the producer and the user so that you can do this effectively, and you have to maybe be flexible about how you are going to allow for both the user and the producer to make sure that they're both getting what they need out of the process. So if you think about the sustainability, what we were getting at there is that we feel that if you only work with one actor from the user group or one actor from the science group, the chances are that you're going to run into trouble. You need to build relationships across the different sort of organizations to make sure that there's actually people that can make decisions at all different levels. So for example, you might find that you want to agree on something between the scientist and the user, and then the head of department for the where the scientist is from says, no, actually we can't do that, that's completely impossible. Now if you haven't got their buy-in from the beginning and make sure that whatever is agreed in the process and have brought them in, you're going to run into a major stumbling block later down the line. So the tip here is to really build the capacities amongst the actors and decision-making levels to enable that engagement to really work, especially post the project. It's one thing to set it up within the project confines, but if you're going to have a sustainable service afterwards, you need to make sure that everybody's bought into it and everybody really wants this and believes in it. So an example here that I'd like to share is from the WISER program. It's from the SCAPIA project, which stands for Strengthening Climate Information Partnerships in East Africa. And there, the co-production process determined that the timing of the seasonal forecast was actually too late to be useful to farmers. And that was a really useful revelation, because if you've already planted your seeds, there's not much you can do when you get told that, oh, it's going to be a dry season this season. So they found that communities that did embrace these kinds of initiatives, where they did take action on the seasonal forecast when it was produced at the right time, saw substantial improvements in their crop yields, not just from the Scopia project, but from many other programs that are doing similar things. The next principle I'd like to share is ensuring value add for all involved, which actually links quite closely to the one I was previously discussing. And that's really about making sure that everyone who's in the room feels that they're getting something out of it. And this is really important because, you know, it's a lot of time and effort that people are spending in these engagements, and they need to show that there's some reason why they're there and that there's some outcome that they're going to be part of and going to benefit from. And so that's why it's really important to co-identify those value adds at the project development stage, so that everybody feels that they're getting some benefit from this. And if you make sure that and do this correctly, you're going to increase the odds of a deep and continued engagement of those actors and the sustainability. So the tip here that we've suggested is to co-develop a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework at the project outset. And that will help you by ensuring that everybody's considerations and the impact that they will require and the outcomes that they want to achieve are all codified, that everyone's clear on what those are, and everyone knows that that's what we're working towards. And that you can keep revisiting them through the learning process to make sure that all of the partners are getting what they need out of the process. There's an example here that was from the Climate Development and Knowledge Network as the Raising Risk Awareness project, which was conducted with the Weather Attribution Initiative, which is a consortium of different partners. And they worked with us to help to see if we could do extreme event attribution analyses in developing countries. So in Africa, we looked at both Kenya and Ethiopia. And extreme event attribution is still quite a new science and is still quite complex. And so when we went to go speak to the stakeholders in the sort of very early stages, it became apparent that both countries wanted to focus on drought event attribution, which is actually quite difficult. It's a lot less straightforward than, say, heat wave attribution. But it was seen as the topic that was going to have the most policy relevance to the stakeholders, and that's what they wanted to know about. So that's why it was sort of co-developed that this would be the pilot for the first study in each of those countries, to build the skill sets to be able to do them in the future with both Kenyan and Ethiopian scientists. They would choose a drought attribution, even though it was going to be a little bit more complex. And I think that was really valuable because it meant that the project partners were a lot more bought into the process and then really felt that they were getting some value out of it. Unfortunately, because it is a complex attribution, the result was that the signal of the attribution wasn't entirely clear. And so there was quite a big range of variability in terms of how much of the drought was attributable to climate change. But it did still build those skills so that people could do further drought attribution or other kinds of attribution in the future in those countries. And it allowed people to understand that there were a lot of variables that they didn't understand well enough to be able to determine whether climate change was acting as a driver for that particular drought or not. So, you know, even if it's not a full success story, I think it really helped to take the researchers involved a lot further in making something that was useful for the policymakers in both Kenya and Ethiopia. I'm now going to hand over to Emma.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And the next in the series of principles, and I hope it's becoming even more clear that a lot of these principles are very interconnected. But the next one is communicating in accessible ways. And obviously for co-production, we're working with a wide range of actors, and it's really crucial that people across the co-production group are able to exchange information and learn from each other, both within a specific project, but also with the wider group of stakeholders. And climate information may currently be being provided through a limited number of channels, perhaps through TV, radio, and so on, and is though then accessible only to a small number of decision makers. So where there are resources, it's really good to think about engaging a wider range of communications and formats and channels to reach a wider range of groups, perhaps using animations, videos, theatre and different forms of format and channels. And really thinking about how we can engage with the partners involved in co-production to identify which are the most appropriate channels and formats for reaching the people that need the information most. And the picture here is an illustration from work in sharing flood forecasts in Kaffrine region in Senegal in 2011-2012. And while it was only a pilot in 3 villages, even this work made it very clear that people want to receive the information in different ways in different villages. So women wanted to receive information at the water fountain, men at the mosques, or on forecast blackboards, and the young people wanted to get the information under the areas where they gather, the talking trees, or through climate radio roadshows. So even within this pilot and within 3 villages, there were significant differences within social groups and within each village. So it just highlights the need to engage local actors in identifying the most appropriate channels and formats for reaching them. But also working in co-production, you often engage with partners across countries, and so there are significant language differences. And also climate services are often currently provided in national or official languages, and there's a real need to think about how we can use a wider range of languages to really ensure the information is provided in languages that are relevant to people at a local level. There's also a frequent need to ensure understanding of key terms and avoid misunderstandings. So if I could have the next slide, please. So existing climate information may use language and terminology, formats and so on that are not readily understandable by non-technical experts. And there's often a wide range of partners involved in co-production, each coming from different disciplines and sectors, and each of those has their own terminologies. So we really need to think about how we explain key terms such as skill, confidence, probabilistic information and so on, and how we're going to communicate these quite often quite complicated concepts in different languages and in ways that are understandable. And often there's a lack of an official recognized standard terminology in the range of languages that are spoken by those people for whom the climate services are intended. So here is an example from Burkina Faso, from the Brace Zaman Labidi project, where a lexicon of weather terms and words was developed, including in French, English, and 3 languages used in the country. The initiative was coordinated by Internews, but there was a wide range of partners involved, the Burkina Met, ANAM, and UK Met, but also a wide range of colleagues from national research institutions, national and local government, farmers, pastoralists, development and media experts. And again, this issue around local knowledge is vital here. For example, in Burkina Faso, farmers describe the wind in terms of where it is blowing to, while the National Met identifies where the wind is coming from. So it highlights once again how vital it is to engage local knowledge, local understanding about how best to really communicate key concepts. Next slide, please. So the next and 10th principle that we identified in looking over existing work on co-producing climate services was improving transparency of forecast accuracy and certainty. And it's really essential that we ensure foundational knowledge of the scientific skill and probabilistic nature of meteorological and climate information, so that all partners can actively participate as equals in co-producing climate services. And this is an area that's often overlooked or under-resourced. But working from a shared understanding of the possibilities and limitations of existing meteorological and climate science capacities, climate information producers and users can together identify the climate information that can support specific decision-making processes and avoid raising unrealistic expectations, as was mentioned earlier. So, for example, in consultation with farmers, they may want to know about the distribution of rain over the course of a season rather than the information they get currently, which may be total seasonal rainfall. And yet, on the other side, the national meteorological agencies may not have the observation networks or the capacities to downscale forecasts to the timeframes and geographic scales that farmers require. So we need a really open dialogue based on understanding of the current capacities. But some national Met agencies have been reluctant to date to communicate the probabilistic nature of climate information, considering that there are difficulties of using uncertain information and that there might be misunderstanding if they are share the skill of the forecasts, and that might prevent people from using it. So this has led a number of national Met agencies to not clarify the probabilistic nature of climate information and present the information as deterministic. Or perhaps they do not include their probabilities and instead use terms to describe likelihood, such as heavy rainfall being highly or moderately likely without having the numerical probabilities, and these might not be clear to non-technical users. And then failure to communicate this accuracy and the probabilistic nature of the information can create mistrust of climate services, so people do not experience what was communicated as definite or deterministic information. And for example, in Kenya, there have been institutions and instances where there has been threat of legal action against the Kenya Meteorological Department, where people felt that the forecasts were not accurate and confidence levels were not sufficiently clear. So we really need to be transparent about forecast skill and certainty. It's also really vital to include probabilities to enable decision makers to make use of climate services. It really requires that people have a clear understanding of the forecast skill and confidence so that climate information producers and decision makers can together establish and agree thresholds for acting on specific forecasts. There are a lot of ongoing initiatives to strengthen what's called forecast-based preparedness, action and financing, but it's really important to acknowledge that co-production of relevant climate services is a long game. So acknowledging the fact that climate information is probabilistic, even where a climate service is tailored to support a specific climate sensitive decision, the probabilistic nature of climate information necessarily means that the most likely outcome may not always occur. But if the forecast is of sufficient skill and co-production has enabled climate information producers and decision makers to together identify appropriate thresholds for action, over the long term, it will be more cost effective to act rather than not act. Okay, and next slide, please. So an instance of where people have tried to ensure that decision makers have sufficient understanding of key concepts. This was work undertaken by Brace Zaman Labidi and AMA 2050 in Burkina Faso, where a workshop was undertaken in 2017 for local government decision makers. And through using a range of exercises and presentations, there were efforts to cover key climate concepts, such as the probabilistic nature of forecasts, and as well as providing practical opportunities for strengthening decision makers' confidence in using these forecasts. But the workshop also had the benefit of enabling participating researchers and climate scientists to better understand the decision-making contexts where their information was being used and the types of information that could potentially support these. Next slide, please. So we've had an overview of these 10 principles outlined and described in the manual, and that have been developed through looking at how people are co-producing climate services across a number of regions and contexts and sectors. But next slide, please. while we've got an overview of these principles, I think it's also very important to think about how we contextualize these. So in terms of contextualizing the principles and making sure that they really are operationally feasible rather than some abstract ideas, this slide describes a series of principles for co-producing climate services that were developed by those participating in a co-production peer learning workshop hosted by the WISER Phase 2 Support to ICPAC, otherwise known as W2SIP project, in Nairobi in July this year. So participants in this workshop were drawn from national Met services in the Greater Horn of Africa region, as well as ICPAC, and a wide range of institutions partnering in initiatives co-producing climate services. So the set of principles were developed before the principles from this manual, and that have been outlined in this webinar, before those were introduced. So the participants themselves came up with these principles before anything was introduced externally. And as you can see, the principles identified by the participants broadly align with the principles outlined today. So the similarities between the principles developed in that workshop and those included in the manual really highlight that there is an emerging consensus from amongst those actively engaged about the principles that underpin effective co-production of climate services. So there is a growing understanding of how we might best support co-production of climate services. But it also should be noted that the participants in the regional workshop highlighted principles additional to or slightly in extension of those proposed in the manual. So for example, they specified principles on accountability, ownership, cooperation, and reliability. So the principles outlined in the manual and this webinar are intended to guide, and there really remains a need to contextualize these principles in whatever co-production initiative you are undertaking, whatever process you're seeking to support. So many thanks, and I'm now handing back to Suzanne to open the platform for your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma, and all the presenters. We've had quite a few questions coming through on the Q&A, some of which we've answered already. So I'll just quickly let you know where to go look. So if you just go to the bottom of your screens, you'll see there's a row of icons, and there's a Q&A button. If you click on that one, you can go and see the questions that people have been putting towards us and some of the answers. So you're welcome to read the answered section, which was answering questions such as examples of non-indigenous, of non-scientific knowledge that we have been using in these kinds of examples, and Catherine's given some information there. Also, there was a question about involving farmers and how they can help with narrative descriptions of risks. There's some answers on that. Saskia asked us whether the webinar will be made available later. The answer is definitely yes. We will be sharing that with you on the YouTube channel, and we'll send you the link after the webinar. It'll take a few days, but you will get that in your inboxes soon. Then there's one about farmers having their own channels of communication and distribution of information, and that we should be using those. There's also one about probabilistic data. There's actually a few. One of them has been answered by Catherine about the challenge of using probabilistic data, even with experienced weather data, and what does this mean that we need to train users? So I think those are the ones that you can go see the answers we've already provided. I'm going to start with the ones that we haven't answered yet, because I think that might be more interesting. And I think that we'll start then with the first one is about on the communication slide. So can I suggest that Emma answers this? Can we think about traditional channels of communication that could be explored? Emma, do you have any response to that one?
Yes, I think it's a really key point, and I think it's really vital that we work out how people share information now, which sources of information they trust, and how best to link that with climate services. And I think what's really vital here is to think about the interconnection, the linkages between how people already receive information, which sources they trust, where they get that information from, and then to link that with the very new, much more widespread forms of social media and so on. So where social media and mass media meet social networks, and how we can tap into the existing networks that people already use. So I think that's vital, and definitely in the work that I've been involved on, we have really sought to engage with thought leaders and religious leaders, for example, and building in all across all the networks that people already really trust in terms of ensuring that we tap into existing communication channels.
Thanks, Emma. Then we've got a question from Omar that do we have any accountability frameworks related to climate information? I think that this is quite an interesting one. I think that it depends how far you want to call an accountability framework. For example, I know that there are lots of projects set up MOUs, so that a memorandum of understanding, so that there's clear parameters under which the climate information and the climate services are developed. Would any of the other presenters like to share a specific example?
I'm happy to jump in here. It's Anna. So if you mean about accountability framework, talking about the ethics of working in the climate services space and ethics of provision of climate information, there has been a little bit of work done on thinking about the ethics and code of practice of working in climate services, and there's an international white paper on climate services ethics. But you're absolutely right that not enough has been done on thinking about the ethics of working in this space and the accountability of the information that's being provided. Most providers of climate information will provide a disclaimer saying that this is the best science that's available and they cannot be held accountable for anything that doesn't happen or is incorrect about the projections. But I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to go into the ethics of working in this space. And this is something that we've been thinking about quite a lot at CSAG. And hopefully we'll be able to start this discussion, particularly in a South African context soon. But it's something that we've been talking about with funders as well, is thinking more about the ethics of providing climate information into different spaces and what should be made, what assumptions should be made clear when doing that, and the assumptions that are made in the modeling process that are certainly not clear and transparent. So that's, I mean, I think one of Emma's slides talks about the transparency, and that's incredibly important, is that we need to be transparent as producers of climate information as to what can and can't be done with this information and where the potential pitfalls are with the information.
Thanks, Anna. I'll then move on to a question from Khalid, which is basically asking, what is the reality for farmers actually being part of this co-production process when they are more confident about their traditional methods? I think that's a very pertinent question. So how do you create this the sense of trust in other forms of information like a seasonal forecast if the community is already quite happy with its traditional methods? Would any of the presenters like to tackle this one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to say something. It's Emma here. I'm just thinking in terms of the assessment of the forecast at the end of the season. Often there's opportunities for ensuring that we get a local assessment of how reliable the forecasts have been, as well as more formal assessment by the National Met Services. So often farmers are actually looking for new forms of, well, in the places where I've been working, farmers have come to realize that although their existing knowledge is useful, there is changes to the climate, and they are looking for ways to support their local knowledge. Not to obviously completely overwrite it, but to see if there are new forms of forecast and information that can complement or strengthen what they've got already. So I think really building farmers' feedback into the assessment of forecast reliability is really vital here. And obviously it takes time. As Anna mentioned, building trust takes time. But I think if it's done over a number of different seasons, and National Met Services make sure to ensure feedback from users of what they actually experienced over the course of the seasonal forecast, for example, and then compare it with the forecast on a regular basis. It can support the building of trust, particularly when people understand, again, what the probabilities mean within the forecast, and how perhaps the forecast at a national level does downscale or might downscale at a local level. So it is an ongoing process, but I think farmers are, in my experience, very open to anything that might help and support their work.
Thanks, Emma. The next question is from Andy, and it's about understanding decision-making contexts, and that this requires establishing what logic underpins the decision-making at the farm level. And he's querying whether most projects have had any focus on that. Catherine, would you be happy to answer this one?
I can have a go. Hello, Andy. And I'm probably, let me switch that slightly to the experience that we've had within Mfulo, which was not necessarily working with farmers, but working with decision makers at national policy level. So we were looking at decision making contexts in terms of how policies and plans and strategies come about, and the interests of different parties which can mould and shape those debates. And I think it was very valuable for us to do that in order to understand climate information needs in the context we were working at national level with policymakers, and absolutely the same would be the case, I think, at if you're working with farmers at the grassroots level. And I think in projects that are aiming to co-produce climate information, there's a lot more recognition that, you know, we really do need to understand the context and the decisions that are being made if we want to have any hope of generating information which is useful and usable to them. So I would agree with you that it's not necessarily been the norm in the past, but I think as we're seeing increasing interest in co-producing weather and climate information, hopefully it will become more of the norm in all these kind of initiatives.
Thanks, Catherine. The next one is from Stephen. In early engagement with users, what advice do you have when it comes to explaining what climate science and climate models are? And are there some good techniques for setting expectations about modeling capabilities, skills, accuracy, and uncertainty, i.e. the very technical information? Anna, would you like to answer this one? Anna, if you are talking, I think you might be on mute still.
I'm sorry. I was just replying to another question in a typing box. Could you repeat the question again?
It's a question from Stephen about early engagement with users, and whether there's any advice on explaining what climate science and climate models are, and are there some techniques for setting those expectations about capabilities of the technical stuff?
Yeah, my answer to Stephen is probably not going to satisfy him, but I think the crux to understand to sharing what is possible and what is not possible comes down to the co-production process. So if you really run that co-production process in a way that everybody is able to share knowledge and have an equal say, and build that trust relationship over time, that there is a sharing of knowledge, so that there is an understanding of what is possible and what is not possible in the science. I mean, we've even gone to processes such as just an experimental process of sitting down a climate modeler and having the practitioner stand around while he runs the model and makes decisions about what to put in, what not to put in the model, and what decisions he makes along the way, to show what is and isn't possible and what the modeling process entails. So this was a really, really interesting process, and really enlightened everybody as to how the different people work within their different disciplines. So I think really it comes down to the co-production process, to share what is and isn't possible, and work together to solve a problem, rather than having a consultation process that everybody goes away with unrealistic expectations.
Thanks, Anna. The next question we have is from Dumasani. It's about, is there any room for participatory knowledge delivery strategies such as farmer field schools and innovation platforms? And I think the answer there is definitely that co-production can take many different forms. And if a farmer field school is a useful intervention to help build the trust and share the knowledge between various communities to be able to get the co-production going, then that is definitely a possibility. I think that's the key with co-production, is that there's no one way of doing it. You can do it in many different ways and use all the networks and techniques that are suitable for that particular context. So I think if anyone else would like to add on to my answer, then you can let me know. Okay, then I will then move on to the next question, which is from Dominic. How can we integrate traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge in the co-production process? I think that's come up a couple of times. So I think what we're really looking for here is a good example of where this has happened already. Would one of the presenters like to tackle that?
Yeah, I'd be happy just to say something on that one. And I'm thinking, for example, about the work in Wiser Western that was mentioned during the webinar, where there were forecasts designed for fishermen on Lake Victoria. But I think this is a situation that's happened in many places. What we really need to think about, what we're talking about, traditional knowledge and local knowledge and so on. And people mean many different things by it. They might mean local forecasts, or they might mean the language that people use, for example, to talk about the wind and the different types of wind. And most importantly, they might think about local knowledge about the impacts. And obviously, this is an area where local people who are affected by particular climate risks have the best knowledge about the impacts, the past impacts. Obviously, they might not know so much about future impacts, but they are able to really clarify what the impacts of particular climate events are. So when we're thinking about integrating local knowledge, I think we just need to think broadly about what we are encompassing within that term. And it's not just necessarily interesting forecast techniques that people often focus on, like entrails of cows and so on, which may be interesting as well, but it's also thinking about the whole way that people think about weather and climate in terms of the impacts and how they describe it, and integrating the language and concepts that people use. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Our next question is from Emmanuel and says, how may myths be dealt with? I think that's quite an interesting one. I think some of the principals touched on this, and I think it's really about this trust building and relationship building that really helps you to deal with those myths. Because if you don't have that relationship, even if you tell someone that that's not really the way things are, and it's, you know, that's not how it's going to work, or this isn't possible, that myth will persist unless there's a relationship with the person to trust that you are a reliable source of information and that what you're saying is trustful. Can I open it to the other presenters to add on to that?
I can have a go at adding on to that, Suzanne. I would say even recognizing, well, even the concept of a myth, I think, is quite interesting where co-production is concerned, because a myth is, to judge something as a myth is a value judgment coming from a particular knowledge system. And when we're co-producing weather and climate services, we're not necessarily wanting to prioritize one particular knowledge system over others. We're wanting to understand how those different knowledges can be used together to generate useful information. So I think this would be, I mean, for the kind of dialogue and the iterative process involving discussion amongst all parties and understanding the decision-making context and understanding the source of different beliefs would be critical. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but I think the framing of identifying what a myth is something which a co-production approach will enable unpacking.
Thanks very much, Catherine. We have flown through this hour and we are now at the end of our webinar time. There's only a few questions left, which we'll try and answer in the chat box or offline after the webinar. We will be conducting a quick poll now for you to just give us your feedback on what you thought of the webinar. I will also put up our contact information for you so that you can let us know if you have any comments or suggestions. My email address is there, and you can send me any comments that you would like about either the webinar or about the manual. Thank you very much.